Hello, my name is Stuart Green, and I'm going to be talking about self-inflicted wounds. These are tales of greed, deceit, and stupidity. I've learned these tales while practicing orthopedic surgery for half a century in Southern California. Most of the people involved are those whom I know personally or are known to friends of mine. In some cases, they are partners in my practice, and in other cases, they are friends. By way of disclosure, I'm one of the founders of the Limb Lengthening Society of North America and have served as past president of that organization. Likewise, I was past president of the Association of Bone and Joint Surgeons and for a long time a deputy editor of clinical orthopedics and related research. I've been a reviewer for multiple journals. I've served as a consultant for NuVasive and received royalties from NuVasive and Smith & Nephew. However, there are no disclosures relevant to the topic at hand. Furthermore, I will not be discussing off-label use of any product or device unless you consider murder and suicide to be the off-label use of guns. Self-inflicted wounds cause lifetime scars. I'm not talking about these kinds of self-inflicted wounds, although as we'll see, the kinds of self-inflicted wounds I'm talking about resemble these in many ways. Let's consider first the use of drugs. Self-prescription of psychotropic medication causes self-inflicted wounds. As physicians, we have the possibility of prescribing standard medications for ourselves by simply putting somebody else's name on the prescription. We often do this when stressed, and unfortunately, these medications have nasty side effects and should be prescribed by someone who is monitoring our health. Let's consider, for example, the case of Jeffrey McDonald.
They called him the Golden Boy. Jeff McDonald seemed destined to have it all. A model Green Beret officer and respected doctor. The perfect father. The perfect husband. It was the happiest time McDonald and his wife Colette would ever know. But it all ended one night. The night McDonald witnessed his family's massacre. The vision he will never be allowed to forget. The crime that will capture the nation's attention. The murder the Golden Boy will be accused of committing.
You're sitting there telling me that I killed my wife and kids.
I think so.
The Army is charging Jeff with 3 counts of murder.
This is the most asinine thing I've ever heard.
Why? I ask you, why?
Jeff's father-in-law will be one of his strongest advocates.
If I ever had another daughter, I'd still want the same son-in-law.
It will become his 9-year crusade to find the killer, piecing together hundreds of intricate details, some even hidden with his buried daughter. But he will have to face the question he's afraid to have answered. Could the man who murdered his daughter be the same man who married her?
After the murders, the Army held an Article 32 hearing, which is sort of like a grand jury situation. Jeff was stabbed during the attack, and he claimed that hippies came into his apartment and killed his wife and children and stabbed him. The incident occurred around the same time as the Manson murders, and so the government had a hard time pinning the murders on him. Jeff left Fort Bragg and came out to Long Beach, California, where he worked in the emergency room of St. Mary's Medical Center. He was a smart guy. He graduated from Princeton. He wrote a book on emergency medicine. But his father, as you saw in the movie, persisted in his investigation. Ultimately, a civil murder trial occurred. Jeff engaged the author Joe McGinnis to write a book to support Jeff's position. However, Joe McGinnis, like the father-in-law, turned against Jeff McDonald and became convinced that Jeff McDonald had in fact convinced the murderers, the same thing that a jury concluded. The book was made into a movie, which you can see for free on YouTube. It's 4 hours in length because it occurred over 2 nights on NBC movies. McGinnis concluded that one of the things that Jeff McDonald did was he started taking Dexedrine in order to lose weight to be on the wrestling team at Fort Bragg. One of the side effects of Dexedrine, which is an amphetamine, by the way, is aggressive behavior. Jeff McDonald, of course, continues to complain to this day that the dexedrine had nothing to do with it because he denies he committed the murders in the first place. He continues to appeal his case, but this is what he looks like today, having spent his entire life since the murders and the conviction in the federal penitentiary. As I mentioned, he had a superficial wound on his chest, but this was considered to be a self-inflicted wound. Self-inflicted in several ways, since he never practiced medicine again. It is illegal to prescribe controlled substances to oneself. Not only that, it is stupid. One of the situations in which one is likely to self-prescribe is during a divorce. It is not uncommon for doctors at around age 45 or 50 to dump their first wife, the mother of their children, and marry some young person from the hospital or from their own office staff. In fact, the cardiology internal medicine group across from my office, that occurred to every of the practitioners in that group save for one. Oftentimes, there is a tendency to self-medicate during the divorce because, after all, the spouse gets half of one's estate and the two lawyers split the other half. My partner started taking Ritalin during this experience. He had already been taking a low dose for a medical problem, and he started taking more of it by writing the prescription to his mother. He became progressively more aggressive in our practice. In fact, we had to basically get rid of him. It is a Schedule II narcotic, and he's self-prescribed, basically. One of its side effects is aggressive behavior. It didn't surprise me, therefore, when I heard, after he had illegally prescribed this substance to himself, that he killed his wife and her divorce attorney in a fit of rage. He was convicted and sent to prison. He used a boning knife. It was, in many ways, a self-inflicted wound, even though the point of the knife penetrated two other individuals, because he never practiced medicine again after he got out of the penitentiary. And in fact, this was a tragedy because he was a very skilled total joint surgeon. In fact, he was the first person on the West Coast to have a laminar flow room. He was one of the first Americans to study with Charnley over in England, and his life turned upside down in a fit of rage. Guns in the home is a very dangerous mixture when one considers the possibility of self-prescribing. One of my partners took his daughter's boyfriend to the shooting range for some target practice. When they got back home, he left the gun in the glove compartment of his car. This is, in the parlance of gun violence, an unsecured loaded gun. That day, his daughter broke up with the young man and told him that she didn't want to marry him. He became despondent. He called another partner of mine, who happened to be the brother of the girl, and that guy prescribed a benzodiazepine over the telephone without what's called a good faith examination. These drugs are used to treat anxiety disorders, and the young man was depressed. And one of the side effects is increased depression. As a result of the increased depression, he took another one, and he kept doing this until he came to the conclusion that the only way out of his misery was a murder-suicide. That is to say, to kill the girl and then kill himself. He went across the street, took the unsecured loaded gun out of the glove compartment of the car, went into her bedroom through the unlocked back door, and shot her and shot himself. However, he wasn't a good shot. The bullet lodged in the middle of her spine. She has been in a wheelchair ever since as a result of a T10 transection of her spinal cord. And the bullet went through his liver and came out the other side, and he spent time in the penitentiary for that particular event. He was the stepson of the owner of the local newspaper, which may have had some effect on the trial. However, it was learned that he swallowed 24 tranquilizers before the attack. Again, a pharmaceutical phenomenon. Talking about guns in the home, more than 35,000 people die every year from gun violence, but we forget that almost 90,000 people are injured by guns that don't get killed and don't show up in the death statistics. More significantly, for the purposes of this presentation, 4.6 million children live in a home with an unsecured loaded gun. That means that at least 150 children are killed each year by playing with one of their parents' guns. If this happens to you, your life is effectively over. It is a self-inflicted wound, even though the bullet went through your child's brain. Every birthday will be covered with a gray cloud. Likelihood there'll be a divorce, especially if the spouse told you they didn't want guns in the house. Then for sure the marriage is over. Your other children may shun you, and you will have a miserable existence from that point forward, perhaps improved a little bit by alcohol or drugs. Interestingly enough, most handgun deaths are suicides. However, nearly 1,000 children die each year from handgun suicides. That means about 3 a day. If one of these is your children, again, your life is effectively over from that moment onward, even though you will continue to live a 30 or 40-year zombie existence thereafter. It is a self-inflicted wound, even though the dead person is your child and not yourself. Now I'm going to start talking about kickbacks. The original focus of this presentation. Kickbacks cause self-inflicted wounds. And what kinds of kickbacks are we talking about? Typical kickbacks can occur from people who own MRI and CT facilities, ordering EMG and nerve conduction tests, laboratory tests, including urine toxicology, medications and compounded creams, hospitalizations, nursing homes and surgery center admissions, the use of durable goods, including surgical implants, prescribing TENS units, prescribing ultrasound and thermograms, shockwave therapy, a big scam in Southern California and around the country, pain management referrals, hot and cold therapy, and disability forms. What do all these things have in common? The answer is each one of them requires your signature on a piece of paper in order to effect payment. That means that there are people out there who want your signature very badly and are willing to pay you for it in one way or another. Let's consider the question of compounded creams, for example. One of my partners was caught up in this scam. Pretty much destroyed his life. There are standard formularies that control the costs of pills. Pharmacists have discovered that they can take certain pills, an antidepressant, perhaps a muscle relaxer, a psychotropic medication, grind them up in a mortar and pestle, add some kind of emulsifier cream to it, put it in a little jar, and since there's no formulary charge for this particular substance, can charge $1,000 if they wish for this little tube or jar of cream, which is then rubbed onto a sore shoulder or a sore elbow. Unfortunately, none of the companies that make these pills have studied the cutaneous pharmacodynamics of any of these medications, and strange things can happen. And these strange things will often incite the interests of the local authorities. Consider, for example, this situation that occurred in Southern California several years ago.
Forrest obtained a copy of an indictment that lays out what prosecutors say was an elaborate scheme that is, centered around pain-relieving creams. Among the criminal charges, involuntary manslaughter. NBC4's Ted Chen has the story you'll see only right here on NBC4 for the first time. Ted.
Chuck, the indicted include more than a dozen Southern California doctors and pharmacists and chiropractors, and the alleged ringleader is a man NBC4 profiled in our Life Connected series last year. Prosecutors say the victims are California taxpayers and a baby boy. Andrew Gallegos was only 6 months old when he died in February of 2012. The coroner found high levels of a pain reliever, cough suppressant, and antidepressant in his system, all of which appeared to be accidentally given to him by his mother, Priscilla Lujan.
She wrapped him in a blanket and put him down, and the next morning she found him cold and blue and lifeless.
Sean McCann is Lujan's attorney, and this is the cream Lujan rubbed onto her knee and shoulder that contained the chemicals found in her baby's body. Transferred, McCann says, when she touched the baby's bottle and when he sucked on her fingers.
It's most likely that it was transferred from the nipple of the bottle or his mouth back into the bottle as he was drinking the bottle.
That cream is now the focus of an alleged criminal conspiracy led by a man NBC4 profiled last fall when he was helping to bring clean water to the African country of Niger. Prosecutors say over a period of 4 years, Kareem Ahmed paid more than a dozen doctors and pharmacists more than $25 million to dispense the cream as part of a scheme to defraud workers' compensation. One of the indicted doctors is Andrew Jarminski, the doctor who prescribed the cream to Lujan.
What's coming to light is that these doctors were putting profits over their patients.
This is a common claim that the doctors put profits over their patients in order to get the kickback. So how do the kickback schemes work? In other words, how does the briber get the money to you? Well, there are multiple ways to do it, and I'm going to discuss each one of these in detail to show you how clever some of these criminals actually are. Far cleverer, by the way, than we are. Cash kickbacks, of course. Consulting agreements, sublease agreements, purchase of receivables, and I'll explain this one in detail, management agreements, gifts, travel, and prostitutes, and we'll look at each one of these separately. First of all, cash kickbacks, getting the money in a manila envelope in the middle of the night in a parking lot when nobody is looking. In some ways, this is quite a safe way to get the money, but it's also in some ways the most dangerous, because if you're photographed taking the package with a tiny little camera like this that costs $5.36, you go directly to jail. Don't pass go. Do not collect $200 as you do in Monopoly, because you're straight up a criminal for taking the money. Furthermore, there's something unseemly about taking cash. So most doctors would prefer to get a check in a kind of business arrangement. And here's the problem with getting a check in a business arrangement. You take the check and you deposit it in your bank account. Your bank then scans the check and turns the check into little ones and zeros, which are then sent electronically to a clearinghouse, which is usually in a different state, which means that the little ones and zeros have engaged in interstate commerce, and therefore you can be found guilty of wire transfer for dishonest services, which brings the federal government into your case. It means your case is going to be tried in a federal courthouse, and it means the judge is going to be one of those lifetime appointees by the President of the United States who has no patience for dishonest doctors or dishonest businessmen either, for that matter. Therefore, for the rest of your life, I want you to assume that every email you send is stored in the cloud. And I want you to assume that everything you say is being recorded somehow, somewhere. And therefore, you wouldn't want to ever say anything that you don't want to see on the front page of the Wall Street Journal. Big Brother is watching you nowadays electronically even more than ever, and they're watching you with their cell phones. They can be watching you with a $5.36 pen as well. Let's consider some of the other kickback arrangements. This is Pacific Hospital of Long Beach, which was purchased by a man named Michael Drobot. Here is what he looked like. And he wanted to bring workers' compensation spine surgeries to this little hospital. And so he started giving kickbacks to physicians to do that. His son owned a distributorship that marked up the cost of the hardware. And so he had a double reason for bringing the patients in. Unfortunately, the feds caught him, and he became a witness for the federal government, which means he sucked in to the criminal case every one of the doctors that he brought in on the scheme. These doctors included orthopedic surgeons, will be circled in red, neurosurgeons will be circled in purple, family practitioners will be circled in blue, and chiropractors in green. And I want to give you some idea of the magnitude of this particular case. These guys are former students of mine, former colleagues of mine, former co-authors of mine, people with whom I have written papers in the Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery, and they are now serving hard time in Lompoc Federal Penitentiary or San Quentin or some other equal facility. How do they catch the big dude? How do they catch the top guy? Here's how it works.
For example, I got this one kid, right? Went to school for environmental science, something like that. He was bogged down by student loans. Turns out his mother needed triple bypass surgery. Right, horrible situation, sure. Terrible. But we got him in at the market at the right time, chose the right stock. We gave him the right guidance. Boom, overnight, changed his entire life. You know, got to put his mother into the best hospital in New York City. It didn't work out for her. Granted, she passed away, unfortunately, but we gave him that opportunity. You know what I'm saying? It's just about setting up the right team, and then overnight, your life can change. What was an intern, what is an intern making a deal like that? Well, in that situation, I mean, in that particular trade, and with one trade, north of $500,000. And I do that for anybody, you know, anybody that needs the proper guidance. Can you say that again? Just the way you said it. Just the same way. I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, come on, you know what I'm talking about. Just say the same. I think what Jordan just did is if I'm not mistaken, you just tried to bribe a federal officer.
No, technically I didn't bribe anybody.
No, that's not the conversation I heard,
No. According to the U.S. Criminal Code, there needs to be an exact dollar figure for the exchange of services. That would not hold up in a court of law.
That's not how I heard it.
No. That's the truth. But I want to...
Jordan was dealing with an FBI officer who most likely went to law school or has an MBA or is an accountant and knows exactly what he wants to hear. And what he wanted to hear Jordan say was this: north of $500,000. Listen again.
What was an intern, what is an intern making a deal like that? Well, in that situation, I mean, in that particular trade, and with one trade, north of $500,000.
That's an I gotcha moment. And that's what happened to Michael Drobot, I suspect. That's what likely happened to Rick Singer, the college admissions scandal guy. And once they get the big guy at the top, then they put a wire on him, they wiretap the telephones, and everyone who's involved in this scheme gets sucked into it.
Paragraph 2.
Talk normally.
The defendant shall participate in undercover activities.
Breathe normally.
Including wearing a recording device, also known as a wire.
After 5 minutes, he'll forget you even have it on.
In conjunction with the investigation.
So that's how it happens. Let's consider now consulting agreements. Consulting agreements are quite common. They're around 20 to 22 pages long, written by a lawyer, full of all kinds of legal terms. This one is for $130,000 a year, paid quarterly at $32,500 per quarter. And the idea is you help the hospital build their business by acting as a consultant in marketing strategy. Here's another one for Tri-City Regional Medical Center, a hospital near where I work. Notice that the consulting agreement is for developing a spine practice, general orthopedic and pain management practices. You have to ask yourself a couple of questions when someone proposes a consulting agreement to you. Number one, did I go to the Wharton School? Did I graduate with an MBA in business and finance and marketing from Harvard or University of Chicago or some other place that would make my time worth $130,000 to a hospital? That's the first question. And the second question is, which you ask to the person who is making the consulting agreement, what happens when I stop bringing my patients to your hospital because I happen to like the other hospital across town? How long will you continue to use me as a consultant? And the answer will be in the very last paragraph of the 22-page consulting agreement, where it says that either party can terminate the agreement without cause in 2 weeks' notice. And if you stop bringing your patients to the hospital, the consulting agreement will be over, friends. Here's another one. Forest Park Medical Center. Trial ends in conviction for 4 physicians. The bribes there were about $40 million in kickbacks as consulting fees. Next, let's talk about the ingenious sublease agreements. Suppose you own a nice office like this. The waiting room is in the front, the receptionist behind that, your little office behind the receptionist, and you've got 3 exam rooms. And you're paying $5 a square foot for this office space, downtown Beverly Hills or someplace like that. The briber comes to you and says, I've got some things I need to store and I don't have enough storage space in my hospital. They're old medical records, they could be respiratory ventilators, they could be anything. And I need to rent space from you. And I would like to take one of your exam rooms and I'll pay you $100 a square foot for that space because I need it so badly. It looks very clean. You sublet a part of your office to another entity for $100 a square foot. The problem is that the fair market value for that property is $5 a square foot. And anyone who investigates these things knows that the $95 a square foot for that space in the corner is the bribe. Dr. T over here subleased his office space in Beverly Hills for $23,000 a month and received an aggregate payment of about $713,000. He is either serving hard time or about to serve hard time because he pled guilty. A friend of mine, I do not know this doctor, but a friend of mine was recently asked to testify about his excellent reputation in the community in order to reduce the sentence that the judge imposes. Next, we have purchase of accounts receivable. This is one of the most ingenious bribe systems I've ever conceived of or heard about. It took me a long time to figure out what was going on when I read this for the first time. But it works like this. Suppose your practice is owed $400,000. But by the way, this is a typical amount for a doctor who's been in practice as an orthopedic surgeon for about 5 or 6 years, something like that. This is money coming in and money going out if you're in private practice. But from bad experience, you know that you have about 25% bad debt. That comes from taking care of no-pays in the emergency room, write-downs from insurance company charges, and so forth. So therefore, the actual value of your accounts receivable is $300,000. What the briber does is he comes to you and says that he will pay you for all of your AR. In other words, he'll become your collector and pay you $350,000 for those accounts receivable. And of course, he could explain, he thinks, or she thinks to any judge, well, I'm just a better collector than Dr. X is. That's why I can squeeze $350,000 out of these $400,000 worth of receivables. He's still not paying beyond fair market value, right? Because the number on the books is $400,000. But nevertheless, the true exchange is $300,000 for the accounts receivable and a $50,000 bribe for the referrals. This scheme can be easily cracked by someone who understands forensic accounting. However, usually it's a whistleblower that blows the whole scheme to pieces. Management agreements. The briber guarantees a monthly income greater than you're currently earning for the same work, basically by becoming the manager of your practice, let's say. And the increased income is the bribe for doing work at their hospital or sending patients to their MRI or ordering pharmaceutical creams or something like that. Here's a management agreement, for example. This Dr. H simply sold an option to purchase his practice. He didn't actually sell his practice. He simply sold an option, just like you would sell an option on a stock. And he got about $1.5 million for that option. He's in trouble. Gifts, travel, and prostitutes. Well, of course, gifts straight up are similar to taking the money in a brown paper bag and get you into big trouble. Travel seems like a cleaner way of getting your bribe paid to you, and it's very common, by the way. However, if you're flown somewhere, even on a private jet, the pilot is required to fill out something called a passenger manifest, and your name will be on that manifest for all time, stored somewhere. You can be rest assured. And it may come up, therefore, that what you got was a trip to a ski resort, a golf resort, a fishing hole somewhere in Alaska, or Las Vegas. These are kickbacks, and they are dishonest services. As for escorts, you're better off picking your own escort than letting someone provide an escort for you. Okay? And the reason for that is exemplified in this case. This gentleman was standing in front of me online at the Academy meeting in San Diego, and 2 years later, he is standing online in a penitentiary waiting to get his lunch, charged with oral copulation with a person under 18 years old and sexual intercourse with a minor, because he did not pick the escort on his own. Instead, it was provided to him by someone else in exchange for services. I don't know if you're familiar with this term. It comes from qui tam pro domino rege quam prosi ipso in hoc parte sequitur, which means he who sues in this matter for the king as well as for himself. It is also known as a whistleblower lawsuit. And the interesting thing about whistleblower lawsuits is the whistleblower typically gets 15 to 30% of the recovery. The whistleblower can be anyone. It can be an employee of yours who is disgruntled. It can be an employee of the other party who is unhappy with the illegal nature of what's going on and sees the corruption in it. It can be someone involved in the scheme who, after getting a certain amount of money, says, this isn't right, I think I'll go to the government or go to a lawyer and bring this whole system down. How do you find a whistleblower lawyer? You simply go to Google and type in the word whistleblower lawyer. A bunch of ads pop up on the top. And I clicked on this one out of curiosity, and I ended up with the firm of Berger and Montague. Have you witnessed fraud being committed against the government? These guys will help you with your whistleblower lawsuit. They will do virtually all of the legal work for you, but it's your job to get the paperwork to confirm the fraud. You get 15 to 30% of the recovery, and they get 30% of your recovery. That's 30% of 30%, but if we're talking $100 million, we're talking about big bucks. Notice of the 6 or 7 causes for whistleblower complaints, the top 5 have to do with healthcare issues.
Medical hardware distributors, and doctors who collected on illegal kickbacks. Attorney Justin Berger shows this invoice, an exhibit in the suit that totals $24,000.
These are bribes to get these surgeons to do surgeries at this hospital with this particular hardware. And much of this hardware, if not all of it, we believe was counterfeit.
Insurance fraud investigator Bill Reynolds, the other whistleblower, says the scheme built the state's workers' compensation system out of millions and put thousands at risk.
We have obtained records now that could generate anywhere from 10 to 15,000 surgeries.
Altogether, about a dozen doctors were pulled into this particular scheme. The lawsuit, which looks like this, was brought to stop rampant insurance fraud involving illegal kickbacks to doctors and marketers in the area of spine fusion surgeries. It involved the use of counterfeit screws and rods. In other words, the screws were made for about $65 to $85 by a machinist in Temecula, California, but the hospitals were charged $900 each. The fraud was uncovered in the following way. The screws and hardware, the legitimate version, were made by two companies, one in South Korea and the other in South Africa. Both were legitimate companies, fully approved by the FDA for high-quality spinal fusion hardware. The sales rep, however, noticed that something was wrong. As he was replacing the used screws in the trays, he observed that they were slightly different than the hardware that was already at the bottom of the stack. That is to say, the logo was different. This is a close-up of a counterfeit pedicle screw in the front and a legitimate pedicle screw in the back. The logo of the company, U&I, on the counterfeit screws looked like this. However, when the screws were sent by the FDA to the company, they said that's not our screw because our logo looks like this. The machinist, when he laser engraved the hardware, forgot to hit the little I button on his laser engraver, which does the same thing as it does in Microsoft Word. That is, it slants the letters slightly so that you end up with hardware with an incorrect logo on it. How do you know you're in trouble? You've been, after all, involved in a scheme involving kickbacks for several years now. Things seem to be going smoothly. It's been written by lawyers. Everyone is happy. Your business is going to the MRI facility, or you're taking your cases to a particular hospital, and everything is going along fine. Someday someone shows up with a search warrant at either your office or your home, or more likely both. The facility is yellow taped by the local police, and the FBI go in and haul out everything you've got. Your computers, your cell phones, your records, your server, whatever you have in your office, they will lay their hands on under the authority of a judge. You panic. You call perhaps the person that sucked you into the bribe who won't say anything. So you call the first lawyer that you know. It could be your brother, it could be your brother-in-law, it could be your son. Most likely, though, it's someone that refers work to you, either a tort lawyer who sends you accident cases or a work comp lawyer who sends you your injured workers. He says, well, unfortunately, I don't do criminal law, although I'd love to help you out, but I'm going to give you the name of the best guy in town. And so you get to meet your criminal defense attorney. He or she started out life as a prosecutor. When they graduated from law school, they wanted to fight crime, and so they joined the United States Attorney's Office if they went to Harvard or Yale or some school like that. Or otherwise, they were in the District Attorney's Office or the State Attorney General's Office, putting criminals behind bars. However, they made a couple of observations over a period of 10 or 15 years. The first observation is they can never be top dog in their office because that is a political job. That is to say, you either have to run for office, which means get donations, do TV ads, and so forth, or in the case of the federal prosecutor, you have to be appointed by the President of the United States, which means you have to be in one particular political party or another and play that game. And the second thing your criminal defense attorney noticed while he was a prosecutor is that the guy sitting across the table from him, or the gal sitting across the table from him, is making 4 or 5 times as much money for doing the exact same work, particularly if there is a white-collar criminal involved. Your criminal defense attorney, therefore, will charge you $500 to $750 an hour to do the same thing to you that you did to the insurance company. But the difference is that when you finally part company 3 or 4 years later, he is going to be wearing a Hawaiian shirt and flip-flops and will be headed to the Mauna Lani or Mauna Kea, and you're going to be wearing an orange jumpsuit heading to the prison cafeteria. By the way, 15-minute minimum. In other words, the 1-minute telephone call to tell you that your hearing has been postponed for a month will show up on your bill from your lawyer's office as a 15-minute charge. Faxes, copies, FedExes are extra. Likewise, payment to witnesses about your character and so forth and so on are also extra. That is to say, they don't come out of the lawyer's pocket, they come out of your pocket. After meeting with the lawyer for a few times and having him do some preliminary research, everything becomes quiet for a couple of years. If nobody in your office or your hospital knew that your home was yellow taped or that your office was yellow taped, then you can go on and continue to practice medicine, although rumors will kind of float around that something bad is going on in your life. More likely, however, people know about it. You may lose your privileges right away if the hospital has a moral character clause or something like that that allows them to dump you anytime they want. Ultimately, however, you will receive your indictment. This one is for the Eastern District of Arkansas. I found it online, and it was for kickbacks for compounded creams. The same time you receive your indictment, the DA's office has a press release to show what a good job they're doing protecting the public. The press release goes to the newspapers, and they mention the time at which you're going to be arrested or you turn yourself in. And so sure enough, as you'll notice in the lower left-hand corner, there is a Nikon photographer with his Nikon camera taking your picture for the newspapers. You get fingerprinted, and you get to be famous. You will be out on bail, however. So therefore, you're not going to spend a lot of time behind bars the first time around. Meanwhile, your criminal defense attorney kicks into action. He reviews records, does interrogatories, takes depositions of various individuals involved. He will have client conferences with you. He will have court appearances, and by the way, he'll charge usually for travel time to and from the courthouse, and will also charge you for lunch in the very expensive steak restaurant across from the courthouse, oftentimes with you. And of course, you'll be expected to pay. There'll be court filings, motions to suppress evidence claiming that it was illegally obtained, that they didn't ring your doorbell twice when they came in to get your stuff, or whatever the law requires. The judge will spend a couple of months thinking about it and then rule against you. There'll be motion of prosecutorial misconduct, saying that the prosecutor, in his press release, damaged the jury pool and therefore they can't have a fair trial. Guess what? That will be ruled against you also. And ultimately you'll face a trial. However, the trial will not happen. Why? Because if you've taken 100 patients to the hospital for kickbacks, that's 100 individual counts. That means with 3 to 5 years for each count, you're facing 300 to 500 years in the penitentiary, and you get persuaded by your very expensive criminal defense attorney to plead guilty to a lesser charge of maybe 1 count or 2 counts, and you'll spend 36 to 48 months in the penitentiary. And all this will cost you about $1 million, for which you've had to mortgage your home and whatever else you happen to have, sell all your stock, and you're broke. All in all, this is a self-inflicted wound, friends. What's the effect on your practice? Well, of course, the referrals will have stopped. Loss of surgical privileges at the hospital surgery center. Even if you own it yourself, they're not going to want you there. You can never do med legals again. Word of mouth will damage your reputation forever. Internet searches will show you to be a criminal. On your personal life, you'll be dumped from your group, even if you're the founder of the group. As a matter of fact, even if all the other doctors in the group have non-compete clauses with you and aren't even partners, they will walk across the street and open a practice in competition with you, even if you have non-compete clauses with each and every one of them. And why can they do that? Because their lawyer will tell them that your non-compete clause is worthless now that you've been indicted as a criminal. No jury will stand behind you. They will stand behind the guys who are shocked by your behavior. You'll be shunned by your friends. We've tried to contact some of my friends and colleagues in the penitentiary, and they don't answer back because they're embarrassed. What that means is you'll golf alone if you can get tea time, but of course your club will throw you out because they don't want bad guys in their midst. You'll be playing tennis against the wall. You'll have big-time spouse problems, especially if your spouse told you, I don't like that greasy guy that's been coming around the house and making deals with you. You should have nothing to do with him, and all that kind of talk will ultimately end up destroying your marriage. Worst of all, your kids will freak out. If they're in elementary school, they'll be bullied because their daddy's a criminal or their mommy's a criminal. And if they're in high school or college, they will drop out, start doing drugs, and will engage in self-destructive behavior like this. This is a self-inflicted wound for your child, but is also something that you brought upon them by your behavior, which was motivated by greed and stupidity. And in the end, the money you will have gotten is not worth it. First of all, it's going to all be clawed back by the insurance company, and the lawyers will get what the insurance companies don't get. And not only that, but what you've acquired for that money is not going to be worth it in the end. People have studied this. For example, this article in the Journal of Consumer Research called When Wanting is Better Than Having, Materialism, Transformation Expectations, and Product Evoked Emotions in the Purchase Process. Professor Richens concluded that materialists believe that acquiring things will make them happier, and they tend to act on this belief by buying more. In popular culture, however, materialists are viewed as being less happy than other people, and this perception has been validated by the many empirical studies that show a negative relationship between materialism and well-being. In an article called Money Giveth and Money Taketh Away, the Dual Effect of Wealth on Happiness, in Psychological Science, thus wealth may fail to deliver the happiness one might expect because of its detrimental consequences for savoring. An interesting experiment in which they gave people chocolate of different qualities, high quality chocolate, low quality chocolate, medium quality chocolate, and they studied how they savored the chocolate. And they found that the wealthiest people didn't seem to enjoy the best quality chocolate as much as the people who are from more normal circumstances. How Not to Buy Happiness by Professor Frank, published in 2004. If we use an increase in our income to buy bigger houses and more expensive cars, then we do not end up any happier than before. The more time we can devote to family and friends, to exercise, sleep, and travel, and to other restorative activities, reallocating our time and money in these and similar ways would result in a healthier, longer, and happier lives. They found that people who win the New York State Lottery typically report the anticipated rush of euphoria in the weeks after their good fortune. Follow-up studies done after several years, however, indicate that these people are often no happier and indeed, in some ways, less happy than before. We're now moving on to our next to the last topic, ownership of ancillary services. These include ambulatory surgery centers, physical therapy facilities, specialty hospitals, MRI and CT facilities, physician-owned distributorships, also called PODs, dispensing pharmacies, and nutrition stores. Many of us own a piece of such enterprises, and they can be quite profitable. One of the problems with such ownership, however, is that the regulations controlling ownership vary from state to state over a broad range. Furthermore, the states can change the law as a result, usually, of some kind of overutilization scandal that appears in the newspapers and brings the matter to the attention of the legislators. Therefore, your $2 million brand new MRI facility, opened with a ribbon-cutting ceremony attended by the mayor of your town, can, after the 1st of January, when the law changes, be worth next to nothing, because you can't refer your own patients to the facility anymore. So you put it on the market and find out that it's worth about 10 cents on the dollar, because 10 other orthopedic groups or specialty groups in your town are selling their machines at the same time. And since only radiologists can buy them under the new regulations, you end up sending it to Lagos, Nigeria, or some other place where you can make some kind of reasonable tax deduction and perhaps recover some of your $900,000 lost in the investment. The fundamental problem is the perception that ownership stimulates overutilization. This is based on a number of papers that have appeared in the literature over the years. Typically, with respect to MRI facilities, they are written by radiologists and appear in the radiology literature. For example, this one, Physician Self-Referral, Frequency of Negative Findings at MRI Imaging of the Knee as a Marker of Appropriate Utilization. What these radiologists did is they looked at the number of negative studies and compared physician ownership, that is to say prescribing physician ownership, to radiologist-owned facilities. And they find that the number of negative studies is much higher if the physician who prescribes the study also gets part of the profits of the facility. The same with lumbar spine MRIs. Physician referral of lumbar spine MRI with comparative analysis of negative study rates as a marker of utilization appropriateness. Once again, there is the appearance of overutilization if the physicians own the facilities that they are prescribing to. Occasionally, the subject appears in the more widely read journals, such as JAMA or New England Journal of Medicine, where they're picked up by the reporters who write for newspapers and magazines. In this study, studies probe self-referral for imaging. Dr. Mitka found that orthopedists who begin billing for MRIs were referring for imaging at a rate of 74 per 1,000 episodes of care before MRI billing and at a rate of 103 per 1,000 episodes after MRI billing. And this data is easily extracted from Medicare data that is available to anyone who knows how to use a computer and can extract data from large data sets. Who's writing these articles? Well, they're written by radiologists. If they're about MRI facilities and they want to get the money instead of the prescribing orthopedists or neurosurgeons, they're written by neurologists. If they're for EMG and other kinds of facilities, sleep studies and so forth, they're written by physical therapists who are working on PhDs if they're about ownership of physical therapy facilities. Regardless of what the law is, the most important thing in all situations is that ownership has to be disclosed to patients, and it's best to record that revelation somewhere in the medical record. And of course, the distribution of profits cannot be dependent on the number of referrals. It must instead be dependent upon the size of the initial investment that the practitioner made. If it's based on the number of referrals, that is a kickback no matter how it works out. All contracts and agreements should be reviewed by your own lawyer who works in your state and specializes in healthcare issues. You should not trust lawyers who write up these agreements based upon some national entity that bills surgery centers for doctors all over the country, because the laws vary from place to place. The question is, if I were the patient, how would I want my doctor to behave with respect to referrals? And that's always the criteria that is used to judge these setups. Lastly, we're going to talk about marketing. Aggressive marketing may lead to self-inflicted wounds, especially self-marketing. If you represent that you have some technique that nobody else in town can do, that nobody else understands, and that nobody else can provide, and that proves not to be the case, then you are creating a self-inflicted wound. Let's consider, for example, the Laser Spine Institute. This was in the news not long ago. Laser Spine Institutes shuts all facilities, including Scottsdale location. And by the way, they did it suddenly. They had 3 facilities in the country, and they closed them all down and laid off everybody instantaneously. Well, what happened? The problem is that we all know that you can't use light rays to decompress a neuroforamen. You have to use an angled upcutting Carricin, you have to use a shielded burr, or whatever else that you have that can cut bone and take the pressure off the nerve root. You can't correct sagittal imbalance or scoliosis with light rays. You have to use pedicle screws, subtraction osteotomies, major releases, and so forth and so on. Therefore, in order to treat these pathologies, these Laser Spine Institute hired the same quality doctors that had fellowship trainings in spine locally or somewhere in the country or in Canada. These doctors have comparable training and will do the same operation as everybody else in town, which means they're going to have the same percentage of dural tears, the same percentage of knocked out nerve roots, the same percentage of postoperative infections, the same percentage of unhappy patients and the same percentage of patients who want to get a second opinion elsewhere. And that's the rub, because they go to someone in town who looks like this, and that guy is angry. And whether or not he expresses the anger in words, or whether he does it by body language or the turn of a phrase, it makes no difference, because it is self-inflicted anger towards the marketing person, towards the individual who claims that they have a better way of doing something, that they can do it nano, or they can do it micro, or they can do it laser, or they can do it robotic, and nobody else has that capacity, when in fact everyone either does or will soon have that capacity to perform the operation in the same way. And that anger will end up resulting in an increased proportion of lawsuits against the practitioners at the facility or the facility itself for false advertising and misrepresentation of what they actually do there. This famous case, Hulk Hogan sues Laser Spine Institute, may have been the coffin nail for the entire enterprise. He didn't sue for malpractice, to my understanding. He sued for fraud or misrepresentation of what they were doing over there at the Laser Spine Institute. He claimed that he lost $50 million in income because his back didn't get better. And to my understanding, they settled for about $10 million with him, but it ended the Laser Spine Institute's dominance in certain markets. Books like this are easily available on Amazon. License to Steal: How Fraud Bleeds America's Healthcare System. Deviance Among Physicians. Statistics in Healthcare Fraud. Metascams. These books are filled with tales of greed, deceit, and stupidity. Unfortunately, they come about as a result of the activities of a limited number of practitioners, but they affect all of us, because it's books like this that lead to legislative changes that result in the mountains of paperwork we have to face every day in our ordinary practices. As the book License to Steal said, the best thing that has happened in this business utilization review is that the public's trust in the medical profession has been eroded. In other words, these kinds of frauds that I've been talking about through this presentation are, for our entire profession, nothing more than self-inflicted wounds for all of us.